we on? Check, check.
All right, we're rolling. Welcome to the IBEX Training podcast. My name is Patrick. This is my beautiful and very fit wife, Kristi. And our goal is to bring you guys some insight into the things that we have learned and implemented into our fitness over the last couple of decades, the things that we were seeing that have worked and haven't worked, and the things that you can apply to make yourselves fitter, leaner, stronger, and better versions of yourself. Recently, Kristi signed up for a marathon with the goal of running a sub 3 hour, which is a pretty big milestone. And she ran her first marathon about 15 years ago. So within that time, there's been a pretty big evolution in how we and you have trained. We're going to talk a little bit about how that has evolved and what you've done differently. So maybe to start, you can tell us when you decided or had the goal to run a sub 3 hour marathon.
A sub 3 hour marathon for me it's kind of always just been in my heart. And the reason being is because when I was a little girl, we went to Boston for my mom to run the Boston Marathon. And my mom ran a 2:56 marathon. And growing up for so many years, I just couldn't fathom how in the heck did she run under 3 hours? I thought that was the most impressive thing, which it still is. And just so incredible, but thinking could I maybe do that one day? And I ran my first marathon and I was like, absolutely not. That's never going to happen. And we'll get into kind of the first marathon and how that went for me. But I was just proud of myself to do that marathon. But I had even more respect for her knowing that she had run a sub 3 hour marathon. And then I found this love for this endurance training. And slowly, the more that I did it, the more that I was like, maybe one day that is going to be my goal. I'm going to check that off and I'm going to continue carrying that torch, the torch that my mom started, and she's passing it on to me. So I've signed up for Mesa, which you led on to, and that's going to be my first attempt at trying to run a sub 3 hour marathon. My prior attempts, that was never on the radar, but I think that I'm finally fit enough and we understand enough and I'm ready to give that a go.
And another big difference from when you ran your first marathon when you were 20 years old to 15 years later, you going for a sub 3 marathon is the amount of strength training that you're doing with your running. When you ran your first marathon, was there any sort of strength training there, or was it just a lot of cardio or running?
Yeah, so when I ran my first marathon, it was a little bit different. So like you mentioned, I was 20 years old, which was kind of fun to think about. I have no idea at 20 years old what inspired me to sign up for a marathon, but I'm so glad that I did. Circling to your point about strength training, I didn't understand the importance of it, and I was always doing a little bit of it. So I was mainly cross training. So I actually was swimming at the University of Louisville, and we would do something called dry land 2 to 3 times a week, 45-ish minutes. It was nothing near the strength training that I've been doing for the last 10 years, but it was some strength training. And looking back, we had something called an iron cardinal where I always excelled. I excelled in the pull-ups. I excelled in that stuff, but that wasn't my focus. That was a supplement for the swimming that we were doing. And I never made it into the sprint group. I was always mid distance. So the sprint group got to do more of the explosive lifts, the power cleans, things like that. I never really got to practice those things or do those. So the first time I really was doing those was in CrossFit. So I did strength train 2 to 3 times a week, but definitely not to the extent that we are now. And I would loop it more in, or classify it more as resistance training and core work and just things to help us feel strong in the water.
Because I know there's, even since we've met, and you ran this marathon years before we even knew each other, but since we met, I remember the difference in how you ate, which was extremely minimal. I'll never forget the first time I saw you get out a pan to literally cook 1 egg for breakfast. And I just remember thinking why are you even bothering? And the evolution of how we have changed the way that we eat to be able to fuel to where you can run and build strength, or at least maintain strength. Because even right now, you're not pushing to be the strongest that you can possibly be. You've got a goal right now, and the more specific that your goal is, the more specific that your training needs to be. But it was a couple of weeks ago that you still hit a heavy back squat, and you were close. We're at an all-time PR, right?
On my back squat or on my mileage?
Well, I mean, I know your mileage is definitely up there. You may have hit all-time mileage, but as far as strength goes, you hit, was that a max or close to a max?
Yeah, I hit 300 pounds for a single and I felt really good and I called it there. And that was coming off of my highest mileage month ever and highest mileage week. So I had just put in 56 miles, haven't really taken like a full rest day, have been lifting, running, listening to my body, but fueling very, very, very well and focused on fueling. And I went out to the garage and I was just going to do 3 singles, get to a heavy and see, where was I with that strength that I had been working on? And I hit 300, which there are many times training for the games, you were in the gym when this would happen. I would dump 300. I couldn't stand it up. So for me, like to be able to hit 300 on the legs that I had, I was super pumped and super amped about that. So I'd maybe 15 pounds, 20 pounds away from my all-time max ever, which I think is pretty dang good.
And I think the point there is that how much we've changed in the way that we eat and being able to train smarter has allowed you to keep high-end numbers like that, even when you're pushing the mileage. So it does get challenging when you're pushing the mileage and trying to peak for a big race like this to push your strength, but you can maintain it if you're training smart and you're eating enough to actually recover. It doesn't mean that you've got to lose all of your strength in order to be more of an endurance athlete, even though those goals start to separate a little bit the closer you get to a big race.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely. You can maintain. And so I do a lot of strength training in off season, which I don't really have an off season currently, but I'm going to call off season outside of that race build, right? So I wanted to hit that heavy single right at this peak of this race build. So now I'm going to be going into these really tough workouts, these workouts that are taking a little bit more just to see what that strength was. So I've been maintaining with the high volume, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to be trying to max every week and PR my marathon at the exact same time. It's understanding like how to balance those two. But the key point is that you can maintain that strength even while running the higher mileage weeks.
Your mileage now in comparison to when you ran your first marathon, what do you think the difference is, and what type of runs were you doing then? And did you even follow any sort of plan, or was it just kind of go out and run?
Okay. So there's kind of been a little history of the marathons. I don't know if we want to talk about that first,
Yeah,
kind of the ones that I did. Yeah. So the first marathon that I ever did was the Louisville Marathon. And that one I signed up for about 2 months prior. So the way it would work is we would train for swimming all year. And so I had a really good cardiovascular base. And then conference would happen, in like that February timeframe. And then we'd be in off season. And I was like, I really want to do something. And there was always the Derby City half marathon, or mini marathon is what they call it. And then the full marathon. I did the mini marathon the first year and I was like, man, I don't know what it was, but I really did not want to turn left to do the 13 miles. I want to see what it's like to run the 26. So the next year I signed up for that 26 miles. And so training for that for me was swimming, doing my resistance training or my dry land with swimming, and then building in 2 to 3 runs a week. So only 2 to 3. I was using all of my cross training background to propel me through. My entire goal was time on feet to make sure that I didn't get injured. And so I would do, 2 runs during the week, pretty light, and then a third run that was my long run. And I just slowly increased mileage. And my mom was always on me, Kristi, don't increase more than 10%. If you increase more than 10%, you will get hurt. And so it was nice to have somebody who had run marathons to have some sort of guidance. But really I was just going out and running, and I'd call her and tell her what I did. And she'd be like, oh my gosh, I had no pacing. My entire goal was time on feet, and just to prove to myself that, I could get these 26 miles done. And so I think my longest run for that first marathon back in 2009 was 18 miles. And we can get into a little bit more why I feel like 18 miles was not sufficient for me when I hit that 21 to 22 mile mark in my first marathon. And then on top of it, the fueling. There was just a lot of things that I did wrong that I had no idea that I was even doing wrong. I was just excited to be running a marathon.
So there was no sort of speed work. There was no like interval runs or anything like that. It was literally just time on feet.
There was no speed work. I didn't even think about speed work, interval runs, nothing like that. I guess I viewed it, I was getting a lot of that cardiovascular capacity in swimming still. So, we're training intervals in the water, very, very different than running. But I had no idea how to implement that. And that's not something that was even on my radar at the time. I just wanted to complete the 26.2 miles.
And do you remember, did you do any sort of taper?
Yeah, I backed off the week before. I don't remember which week I did my long run, which is kind of something that I've been paying a lot more attention to this go around, which the previous 4 times I haven't done. So that first one, I was just surviving. I was just like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to run this marathon. I'm going to see. I had no time goal. I had no idea what a pace could be. I don't even know if I had like a GPS watch. I was just out there running, and it was just as raw and as pure as it could be, just trying to check off a goal on my bucket list.
For your first marathon, you ran a 3:30.
Yes.
And was that a surprise? Were you happy with that? Did you have a goal time for your first one, or were you just looking to finish your first marathon?
Yeah, no goal times. That was a total surprise. And actually, I didn't even know this, like how any of this worked. But I crossed the finish line and have like that little tin thing around me, the foil thing to keep you nice and warm. And I'm just like completely out of it because I only drank 1 cup of water during that race. I didn't fuel at all. I was Strugglesville from mile 21. There's a picture of my dad somewhere that picks me up. And all it is my dad and I at like mile 21. And he's like, you're not going to quit now. Like you can do this, like pulling me through. I don't even know how they found me. I was like the only person. It was not busy at all. It's a really cool picture. I'll see if I can dig that up. But when I finished, they're like, you qualified for Boston. I was like, I qualified for Boston. Like, what? What does that mean? They're like, you have to go run it. Because circling back full story, that's the race that I went with my parents when my mom ran Boston. And so I didn't even like think about it. That wasn't on my radar, but I was like, oh my gosh, like my mom did this. Like, I want to do this. Like, this is so cool. So then of course she convinces me and I sign up and we go to Boston. And that's how I actually celebrated my 21st birthday, was running the Boston Marathon. So for that one, I had a little bit more understanding. I think I took a gel or 2. I didn't do any speed work. I did the same kind of build, just coming off of my conference season because I was still swimming at Louisville. My coaches were really great. They gave me some grace. They let me out of a few of those spring practices to get a little bit more running in. So I was probably running 3 to 4 days a week instead of 2 to 3 days a week. But still just doing it to be proud to show up and doing something that I remember watching as a little girl that my mom ran.
So that was your second marathon. Did you have a goal time to shoot for Boston, or was that another one where you're like, I think I could probably run quicker, but there wasn't necessarily like something that you were shooting for?
No, I had no goal times. And I think I didn't set goal times because I am a goal-driven person. And in swimming, I had goals constantly. And so this was my reprieve and my break, my mental break from competing as a D1 athlete. So I was just out there doing it, just wanting to push myself and challenge myself and using that internal drive just to see how far, how long, how fast can I run this? I didn't have any times in mind, no pacing, and I ended up dropping 20 minutes.
That's wild. That's a pretty big drop from one to another. And they were what, 1 year apart?
Yeah. So my first one was in April of 2009, I was 20 years old, and that second marathon would have been April 2010, and I turned 21.
And then about a year later, you ran your third marathon.
Yes. So after running Boston in a 3:10, I finish again. No idea this is even a possibility. I cross the finish line, and sure enough, my mom's like, you qualified for New York. And I'm like, what? What do you mean I qualified for New York? That was not on my radar. I didn't understand this whole process. Like I mentioned to you earlier, it's like, this was my break from this rigorous D1 athletic world as juggling a business student, trying to just do all of these things. And it's like, I wanted something that was just a hobby that I could do for fun, that was just me in my own headspace. And that's what this was for me. So when I crossed and it's like, you qualified for New York, you have to do New York. I didn't understand the prestige of New York. I had no idea. So of course I'm like, oh, well, New York sounds kind of cool. I've never been to New York City. So we sign up and we go run the 2011 New York Marathon. And I believe I would have been 22 at that time.
When I first started fitness, I had started running, but I found CrossFit pretty early on, and that was my primary source of training. It was CrossFit and more traditional or conventional bodybuilding. Kind of still going to more of a Globo gym and getting kind of hypertrophy work in, but I really liked CrossFit. And that's where we met, and you kind of took a break from your marathons just in general to train and compete at the CrossFit Games. And kind of in that window of about 8 years in total, 9 years, there was a big detour between the endurance training and the strength training, because being a smaller athlete in CrossFit, you were at a pretty big disadvantage for most of the strength events and the shorter, more power output type of events. So that took an incredible amount of work to kind of catch up and put on strength. During that time, how much weight do you think you put on from when you ran your marathon in 2011 to maybe when you finished your competing at the CrossFit Games?
I would say about 20 pounds.
Which is wild, because you were what, 5'3"? I don't know, 5'2"?
Hey, I'll 5'3" on a good day. No, 5'3" never. 5'2" on a good day. I'm about 5'1.5".
So that is a substantial amount of weight, which is basically all muscle, because you are extremely lean. That is an incredible amount of muscle to be putting on. And then post CrossFit Games, running your next and, most recent full marathon at, again, an even faster time with a big detour from strength training or big detour from endurance training to put on all that strength and still have the capacity and engine to be able to run another PR marathon.
Yeah, that one was surprising. So that was fun for me because that was also your first half marathon. So Patrick had never run a half marathon. And after we finished the 2022 games, it was kind of like we were doing the 5K day with our IBEX training community. And I just really, from that 5K day, started to fall back in love with running. And I was like, wow, I haven't been this excited to run since I ran my last marathon. And that last 2011 marathon was actually not a great experience. I ended up running 4 minutes slower, had an upset stomach. I did a lot of things wrong on that marathon. And that just I was just like, you know what, I'm going to take a break from this, got into the whole CrossFit thing, never looked back. Then doing that 5K day just really sparked that love for running again. And so we signed up together at the last minute. Again, it wasn't something that we had planned months in advance, but we probably signed up 2 months out. And you were going to do your first half and I was going to do that full. And I kept being like, oh, I'll do the half with you. And you were like, Kristi, if I'm doing the half, like you have to do the full. And so that's how I ended up in the full. But yeah, it was so surprising to me when I crossed the finish line on that full to circle back to like the strength training and the endurance world that I'd set the endurance world aside and focused solely on trying to put weight on, trying to get stronger to be able to compete with girls that were bigger and stronger than I was when I was entering into CrossFit. And I PR'd my marathon by 6.5 minutes. And I literally remember looking at you. I felt so good after. My knees didn't hurt. My last mile was my fastest. I felt like I had so much left in the tank. And I just remember looking at you thinking like, holy smokes. Like, I feel like my world was just open to so many more possibilities and like understanding how to fuel and strength train to hit all of these other performance goals.
And we'd made like huge strides in that time frame, learning a lot about how to fuel recovery training to just train smarter. That there was a huge leap in our understanding. But even since then, I think it's done another leap. And I know for the marathon in 2022, there was very little fueling during that race also for you, right?
That was my best one ever, but still very little fueling. And I know it's because I didn't practice it leading in. So like what I'm doing for this race is very different. So I'm practicing the fueling and I'm understanding that importance. But I put in, I think, a total of about 75 grams of carbs in that marathon. So I ate, which I would not recommend doing because it was actually a little bit hard to chew when I was starting to get really tired. But I carried a pack of shot blocks and I think there's about 50 grams of carbs in all 6 of those blocks. And the reason I went with those is because I ate them during the CrossFit Games and I knew they didn't upset my stomach. So like I said, we signed up for this like a little bit closer, so I didn't have a full marathon prep. I was really going off of all of the cross training and the CrossFit and the training that I had been doing and then building in some runs. And so I was like, okay, I know shot blocks work. So I put those in and I probably started those around mile 12 or 13. And then I specifically remember getting to mile 18 or 20 and be like, ooh, I was kind of fading. So I took another gel. And so I took about, that gel probably had 20 to 25 grams. So probably 75 grams carbs total throughout that 3-hour race. To give you a little bit of insight on what I'm looking to do or how little that is, I'm looking to go 60 to 75 grams per hour for a 3-hour race on my next marathon. So I took about a third of what I'm looking to take on the one upcoming.
So I think it's a really big point to understand there's a difference between being able to finish without necessarily giving yourself the fuel that you need versus actually being completely fueled throughout the race and being able to perform at your best. And I think that in combination with having a better understanding of your paces and your capability, you tend to be a really slow starter, which is fine. And you definitely make up for that on the back half of the race, but it's also just kind of unnecessary. And if we can work out those paces to where you're holding something a little bit more consistent with a shorter build into your mileage, that you can, shave off that front end, hang on for the middle, and maybe pick up still on the end, which I think would just be a different approach than, you've taken for any of your other marathons.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to really giving it a go.
And how far out are we now from this race?
We are about 4 weeks out, 5 weeks out.
And we're 5 weeks out. When will your last big run be? And after that last big run, how much running will you do between that kind of peak mileage and actual race day?
Yeah, so I'm going to do it a little bit different. Usually I do my last big run 2 weeks prior, and I like to get up to 22 miles. So I mentioned that first marathon, I only went up to 18. And I felt like I hit an absolute wall at 21 to 22. Like I just felt like my body was not prepared. Mentally, it's like 18 to 26. It's in your head, you're like, oh, it's only 8 miles. And then you get into it and you're like, oh my gosh, it's 8 miles. So then from there, I started going up to that 21 to 22 for that Boston and New York marathon. And that did make a big difference because you get to that 22 and you're like, oh, 4 more miles, like basically just past a 5K. How many times have I done a 5K in my life? I can do this 5K. I'm going to get through this 5K. So I did that for Boston, New York, and I made sure to get up to that 22 prior to the 22 marathon where I ran that 3:04. But I did those 14 days out. And what I'm learning is, so in CrossFit tapering, everybody's bodies are so different. But what I've learned is that running, that fatigue that you build up in these big prep blocks takes a little bit longer to flush and let your legs be completely fresh for that race. So what I'm going to do this go around is I'm going to try it out a little bit different. Is I'm going to go my last big run 21 days out or 20 days from the race. And then I'll start dropping that long run slightly, but intensity will stay up. So I'll still hit a good speed workout session or a threshold session to keep that turnover so my body's ready for it neuromuscularly, and then also to keep the intensity. So it's not like I just go sluggish for 2 weeks and then show up and think I can race. I'll keep those sessions. It's just the overall volume will be a little bit less so that my body can continue to recover from those sessions and rebuild to be fresher. Where CrossFit, I was a little bit different. If you remember, I would hold out until, we'd train hard the Saturday before we'd leave for the games. The games would be starting that following Wednesday. We'd really take like a 72-hour drop taper because I felt like otherwise I was way too sluggish when I was competing at the games. So this is going to be a significantly longer and a different taper from that peak week.
And I think that's one of the most common questions that we get, or people are really hesitant, especially coming from the CrossFit style of training, that people that then want to run a half or full marathon, they have a really hard time taking enough of a break before their race to actually give themselves the time to recover and be at their peak performance. People feel like they're not going to feel fresh, or they feel like they're going to be slow, but there's a big difference between prepping your nervous system for something that's fast and high explosive, like a heavy lift. Like you wouldn't want to wait 2 weeks if you're going to max out your lift. You wouldn't squat heavy and then wait 2 weeks and then test your back squat without squatting anything in between. You need to prime your nervous system. But for these long endurance events, that you don't have, that isn't a factor. So you don't need that priming, and you need to be recovered. You've already put the work in. You want to feel fresh. You want a little bit of blood flow, but you want to be completely recovered going into that race.
Yeah. And I think another notable point on that also, that's a big question we get, but also something else I struggle with is, a lot of times during the deload, I'm hungrier than when I am training for it. So it's like in your head, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm hungrier now, but I'm doing less mileage. So I'm probably burning less calories, but what your body's doing is it's trying to recover from that huge build that you've been doing. And it's repairing and recovering so that you can put your best foot forward on race day. So I think the most important thing to do is just listen to your body when it comes to making sure that you force yourself to deload. It can be so hard. Like I'm one that I love the training. Like half the time I finish the race and I look at you and you know this, or finish the games and I'm already like, I can't wait to get back to training. Because training for me is like the part that just really scratches the itch. I love seeing how hard you can push yourself, but the training, I'm pushing myself so hard so that I can still toe the line and I can step up to race or step up to compete. And that's kind of in my head is like, you always reap that reward. And I don't even want to use the word reward, but it's the work that you're putting in behind the closed doors that shows up on race day or the day that you compete. It's not that you rise to the level of the occasion. You're going to sink to the level of your training. And I think that's something like that I always like to remember. And that's where those deloads and those tapers are necessary. You've been doing all of this work. You're working your tail off. You have to deload and you have to taper to reap the full benefit of the work that you've put in.
It's something people see a lot on social media right now, and it's like pretty popular, is like the running slow. And I think there's 2 legitimate reasons for that, but I'm not sure everybody always has a good understanding of like why everybody's saying like run slow. And I think one of those reasons is, I think largely people overestimate their ability to run, especially when you're maybe a newer runner and you can run for a mile or a few miles at a average or a decent pace. But after that, your heart rate gets into a zone that it shouldn't be, and you're not able to maintain that same pace, or at least at the same effort level. And if you're working in a higher zone than you should be for the distance that you're running, might be able to do it that day, but you're not going to be able to repeat it day after day. And it becomes more of a hindrance to your training, even though you ran that 5K or 10K or whatever your run was quickly, the goal is not always to run whatever your run is as fast as you can.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple reasons. There's scientific reasons, like with your mitochondria, like it's proven running slow is going to help your aerobic capacity. But then it's also going to help you recover throughout the week. And it's also just going to give you more time on your feet without beating you up. So to do something consistently over and over, that's how we're going to get better. And a lot of times people just want to get better at running faster. And that's not what's going to happen. It's 80% of my runs are spent running slow. And the whole point is just continue building the base, fine tuning my economy, my efficiency, understanding. And it's pretty wild what happens when you can actually stick to this. I would say this is the first time I've ever done this also, is continuously putting in those miles. What starts to happen over time is you start to get fitter. So that pace that feels easy goes from maybe a 9-minute mile pace to an 8:30-minute mile pace. And so that pace is continuing to decrease, even though it still feels easy. Now at an 8:30 mile pace, your heart rate is the same as what it was at that 9-minute mile pace or lower. And so you're slowly getting fitter, but it should be 80% of your running should be spent at that easier, slower running, because it's going to help your body with the lactate thresholds. It's going to help the mitochondria. It's just going to help you become a more efficient runner. And I think that's the piece that everybody wants to skip. It doesn't take weeks. It takes years to build that aerobic capacity and that foundation. And you just have to keep showing up.
And I think especially coming from the CrossFit background, people like to go hard. They like to feel like they dug themselves into the ground, but you can also you can work smarter and not feel beat up, not feel beat into the ground, still make a lot of progress and have the energy throughout the week to where you haven't dug yourself in a hole, to where when you're not out running or working out, you've got the energy to go about your life and be with your kids, your family, and not just want to take a nap or eat the entire kitchen. And the other thing that I think people miss as well is running is literally a skill, and it is a learned skill. So when you are running slower, you have the ability to get more proficient and become a better runner. Anything you're doing at a close to maximal effort, mechanics are going to break down. It's hard to focus on your running economy, and you're just thinking about either surviving or holding your pace. And when it comes to race day, it's going to be the exact same. So if you can practice the good habits, practice your actual running mechanics, when it comes to race day, you are far more likely to be able to maintain those. I mean, there's a huge benefit to just being able to run efficient. If you're expending less energy to run the same distance, of course people are going to want that. That is a huge upside.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a good thing for people to recognize is you don't have to have all the fancy gadgets. You can go off of feeling easy. Those runs, you should be able to hold a conversation pace, just like we're talking now. More than a sentence. Milo stretching. More than a sentence at a time. And the other thing is you could take 180 minus your age to give you kind of that max aerobic threshold. So I'm 35 years old. 180 minus 35 is going to be 145. I'm going to try to keep all of my easy runs, my heart rate under 145 no matter what. I don't want it to peak past that at any point in time. The lower under that I can keep it, the better.
That can also vary. So you're watching your heart rate more than your pace. And on one day, that pace may even be a little bit slower or faster, depending on how you're feeling, but you're still watching your heart rate more so than your pace, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's days that I'm I'm going to feel so bad today. And I go out and my heart rate's staying low and I'm just cruising and I feel great. So I think I always pay more attention. So I've started changing a lot of my runs from total distance. I will do distance in this marathon build just because I need to know that I'm going to be able to hit the distances I need. But in my base building phase and my maintenance phase, I'm doing a lot of minutes on my running. And the reason being is that was a way for me to pull back the curtain. So I stopped focusing on my pace and trying to hit certain distances, because by doing that, I would be focused on the pace and trying to get an X amount of distance done, and then I just threw easy running out the window. So now I just shot myself in the foot, because now I'm going to not recover as quickly. I'm not getting that easy running in. So if I'm okay, I'm going 45 minutes easy today. Here's my route. Let's see what I get. Someday I might get 5 miles. Someday I might get 5.4. And that's going off of how I feel, kind of keeping an eye on that heart rate. Heart rate doesn't have to be the end all be all, but it is a really good gauge for you to make sure that you're not pushing the envelope too far.
We always tell people the closer you get to the race, the more you've got to back off of your strength training, the effort that you're putting into that. And at least a minimum of 2 to 3 weeks out, you're probably just going to take legs out altogether. But as of right now, you're about 5 weeks out. What does your strength training or your training outside of running look like?
Yeah, so I probably am a little bit different. I won't take legs out altogether, just because I like training legs and I like feeling my legs when I run.
I think you're probably a little bit more unique in that.
Yeah.
Most people don't, and if their legs are sore, they're not going to run better or faster.
Yeah. So, but you asked, so I definitely, I won't take legs completely out. I'll go down to 1 or 2 days a week. So I like to keep the activation. I want my glutes to stay strong and activated. I want to feel my hamstrings. I'm not going to be making myself sore. So I'm going to drop that weight percentage down into that 60 to 70%. So I'm not pushing upwards of an 8 out of 10 RPE, but I'm staying at 6 to 7. I'm moving to get blood flow because my body is used to moving in the gym, and my body, I don't want to just completely flip it upside down and have no idea like, oh my gosh, I haven't trained in 3 weeks. So I will continue keeping all my core stability work in. I'll keep all my single leg work in, and I'll go more towards activation style stuff for my glutes and my hamstrings, just helping me prime so I feel good. But what it's not going to be doing is pushing the envelope or putting any fatigue into my muscles. So it's understanding the difference, and I'll do that about 3 days a week.
It's been 15 years since your first marathon. That's a lot of miles. That's a lot of training. And often people are beat up over 15 years of hard competitive training, especially 7 years of competing at the CrossFit Games. Like that's hard. And you still feel good. Like you don't really have any aches and pains. You're still strong. You're still fit. You're not working around injuries. And I think that a big thing that allows you to do that is the preparation and making sure that you're using your glutes and your hamstrings, and you've got strong ankles and knees. And prior to your runs, you spend time activating and mobilizing to be preventative to where those things don't become problems. And I think that it also makes you a stronger runner.
Yeah, I think the little things matter. Just like with anything that we do, the little details are so important. And so taking care of your psoas, taking care of your hip flexors, making sure that your calves and your Achilles are strong. Think about how many times you are pushing through the ground. That's essentially a single leg calf raise as you're running. And I think people don't recognize all of those things. They just think, I just want to go out and run. And I don't want your brain to be flooded with way too many things to think about when you run. But if you can take care of each individual moving part, like you're going to feel better. You're going to feel stronger. You're going to become more efficient. We're not going to have these aches and pains. So we don't start, babying this right ankle and then putting all the pressure on the left side. And then all of the left side becomes injured. So it's understanding, and it's just kind of trying to be proactive so that we can prevent the little things that pop up. Because no matter who you are and what training you're doing, you've seen it. You're behind the scenes, I'll always have some sort of phantom injury about a week or two before the race. I'm like, dang it, my left foot all of a sudden. And then I get to the race and I don't even think about it. And so things pop up throughout the training, especially with the volume, the intensity that you're doing. And we become hyper aware of our bodies. And we just want everything to go so smoothly. So sometimes understanding that things are outside of our control, we can't control everything, but the things that we can control do matter. And there's a lot of those little details that do matter.
Yeah, I think those like phantom injury type things that pop up before a race or a competition, most of the time, like everybody's going to notice them or be aware of them during training, and they don't really think too much of it. Like it just kind of is what it is, just comes with the territory. You're a little sore, something's just a little achy, but nothing's actually wrong. But the nervousness of coming up to a race, it kind of gives you something to focus on that could be a problem. So it's not even that it's bothering you more. It's just like, oh, is that going to be the thing that causes me a problem? And it allows your mind to kind of drift into something that, justifies being a little bit negative, as you get closer.
How many times did I have this? Was it every single year?
Basically every one.
And Pat would always look at me and be like, I think we're exactly where we're supposed to be.
And I think making light of it kind of helps take some of the pressure and tension off, to be like, yeah, no, this does seem to happen every time. And that means more likely than not, it's probably not an issue this time either, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't feel like it. And it's just kind of overcoming that mentally, getting your head in the game and knowing that like you put the work in, you're capable of doing it. And if something feels a little tight, it's probably going to warm up into the race. Not that if you have an actual injury, you should continue, like that isn't smart, but most of the time it's in your head and it's not going to be the problem that holds you back.
Yeah, and I think that's the most important piece. Like if you weren't around, I probably would have been like, we're shutting it down. I've got a real injury. I'm not competing. So I think it's having a support system and an accountability buddy, whether that's your coach, your spouse, your best friend, like what that is, to be like, hey, it's okay. You're just nervous. Exhale. Like you're just putting your worry into something, like you're gonna be okay. You've done the work, you're ready. And for me, like that's been super, super helpful. And I'm starting, it's kind of a joke between us. I'm like, oh, something's hurting. Looks like we're getting close to a competition or a race. And then it's like the thing that hurts. And usually there would be like an event in the CrossFit Games. I'm like, oh, this is gonna kill it. And I like come off the floor and you're like, how'd you feel? I'm like, I felt amazing. And so it's just like, it can be in your own head, but being able to understand, like you said, the difference between what is an injury and kind of what are you just kind of ruminating and putting that worry and that stress into, and having somebody, whether that's a bodywork or whoever, being able to make that differentiation is absolutely key.
Yeah. And there's a huge difference between kind of this race and the personal goals being set for you or the reason for doing it versus competing at the CrossFit Games. I think there's probably a little bit more enjoyment now chasing something that's been a goal of yours for a really long time and wanting to check that off for no other reason than your own personal satisfaction of saying like, I worked really hard and I did that, in comparison to kind of getting into the cycle of the CrossFit Games seasons. And there's always kind of the making it to the next level. You got to make it through the open, make it through regionals, qualify for the games. And it's super stressful. There's a lot of stress that comes from that season and not knowing what the events are going to be, how the games are going to play out or anything like that. And there's a little bit more knowns here that I think also make it a little bit, it's like, this is the thing that I'm preparing for specifically, and I'm doing it just for me. And it seems to be a really satisfying process for you to kind of chase something different.
Yeah, I think I like goals. I'm a goal-driven person. So ever since I was in high school, I used to write my swim times on my mirror. First thing I'd see. So having a goal is what motivates me. And that goal doesn't need to be tied to my identity. And where I think sometimes in the CrossFit Games, which that's a whole nother thing we can go into on another time, is tying that placing to my identity. This is just something that I want to see, like, how hard can I push myself? Like, what can I actually achieve here? And I'm doing it just for me. I had somebody ask me, well, what place do you want to get? I'm like, place? What time do you want to get? Yeah, I have an idea. I'd like to be under that 3-hour mark. And I have an idea of my pacing, because in racing, you do have that pacing. Well, I'd like to be a little bit more than under the 3-hour mark. I'm hoping for, around that 2:56 that my mom ran. Just because, she qualified for the CrossFit Games. I qualified for the CrossFit Games. She ran a sub 3-hour marathon. Now I'm going to try to run a sub 3-hour marathon. No, it's really fun. And it's really cool to have someone so inspiring that motivates you and drives you. And I'm just lucky to have her have paved the way for me to do it. But back to what I was saying, it's just an enjoyable process. And it's good to have these goals and then to have something to work towards. And I think it's also important to not set too many. So a couple people have been like, okay, well, what are you doing after this? It's like, well, I don't know. I'm enjoying the process and I'm enjoying the journey of this one. And I don't want to take away from this one by scheduling 10 other things and starting to worry about those. Let's get through this one. Let's reflect on this one. Let's see how I feel. And then we'll go to the drawing board and we'll see, okay, what's my heart pulling me towards next? What else have I wanted to achieve that maybe it's a good time to check off? And I think that sometimes we can put so much on our plate, even when we're just doing it for the enjoyment of us, that it can take away from the current process and the journey that we're in.
We're now starting 2025, and I think it's a great thing to have goals. And you don't always have to put a ton of pressure on yourself, but I also think it helps get and stay motivated to make progress rather than kind of floating through, staying with your normal routine. You do this on Monday, you do that on Tuesday, and you just kind of cruise through it, and it is what it is. And there's not a whole lot of change or difference in effort maybe from week to week. It's just kind of part of the routine. Having some sort of goal, whether that's getting leaner, running a marathon, having a squat number that you want to hit, just having some sort of goal that you're actually working towards that can keep you accountable, and there's some sort of measurement there, is really beneficial for people to stay engaged and feel like they're actually working towards something and they're going for the runs, they're working out for an actual reason.
Yeah, I think it's the most fulfilling thing in the world. Like, I cannot tell you how many times that this goal has pulled me through when my motivation is lacking, because you don't always feel motivated. Like, how was it? I think it was last Saturday. I had my 20-mile run workout, which is probably the best session I've ever put in to date running wise. I came home and I could not believe it. The amount of procrastination for me to get out the door to do that 20-mile run was unbelievable. And then I come in and I'm like, a smile is as big as my ears. I'm like, you won't believe what pace I held. I hit everything that we had intended for me to hit. And it's like, literally, I live for that feeling. And so it's like having those goals pulls you through on those harder days, because it's like, I set this goal for myself and I need to do the work to achieve it. If I don't do the work, I'm not just going to get the result. You get what you earned. And it's not that if you don't put the work in and you don't earn the time, you're not going to get it. So whatever I run at Mesa is going to be what I earned. And I'm hoping that I've put enough work in to get the time that I'm hoping to achieve.
And we'll wrap it up there for our first episode for today. Hopefully you guys liked it. If you've got ideas, comments, anything like that you would like to see or you would like to know or for us to talk about, put that in the comments below. We'll catch you guys in the next one.
Have a great day, guys.